In the years following his acceptance as master painter in the Antwerp Guild of St. Luke, Rubens set out on what was surely an arduous trip across the Alps that would result in his 8-year Italian sojourn. Here in the Italian city, the already erudite Rubens imbibed the lessons of the ancients and their early modern inheritors, seeking a new original pictorial idiom befitting his new status as master painter, whose ambitions included, in his words, being, quote, compared with no other, end quote. As Rubens's nephew Philip observed, the painter was, quote, seized with the desire to see Italy and to view firsthand the most celebrated works of art, ancient and modern, in that country, and to form his art after these models, end quote. However, despite his early self-fashioning and as a humanist pictor doctus, an aristocratic gentleman painter too, Rubens turned time and again, especially around 1609 to 1615, to painting rough and ruddy working male figures that appear to delight in more prosaic physical matters. Muscular and minimally draped porters, executioners, wrestlers, blacksmiths, and other figures associated with physical struggle or strained effort make regular appearances as rough sculptural disjunctures in otherwise virtue-laden history paintings. Given their non-idealizing appearance and the fact that unskilled manual laborers were widely associated in Rubens's day with base servitude, this begs the question: what was Rubens's relationship to such working figures, and indeed the work of painting, particularly in the years when he was most concerned with developing an erudite masterly style? And how do these signature working figures square with Rubens's desire to be seen as an intellectually and socially elite painter of the highest order? This paper will argue that through such lowly laboring subjects, Rubens worked to forge a new recognizable figural type in Antwerp, grounded in the theoretical and philosophical lessons of his Italian period. This included Rubens's continued engagement with the ideas of his philosophical mentor while in Italy, the Leuven philologist Justus Lipsius. A series of paintings and drawings executed in the years that Rubens returned home to Antwerp suggest the depth of his early interests in the prodigious males engaged in unskilled manual acts. Like the Madrid Adoration, St. Christopher as Christ-bearer and the slightly later Cannes Meeting of Abraham and Melchizedek, dated to 1615, features seemingly ignoble porters in otherwise strikingly noble contexts. Flushed executioners prominently support the 1610 elevation of the cross, while in the descent from the cross, a man at top struggles to catch the crucified Jesus as he slips heavily downward. And in the 1609 Miraculous Draught of Fishes oil sketch, such prodigious working bodies strain to heave the weighty cargo ashore in a painterly style that itself looks worked. I'm sorry you can't see that. Often in these highly rhetorical paintings, these superhuman laborers also act as a figural counterpoint to amplify more virtuous themes. In the Madrid Adoration, the ruddy porters with Caravaggisti dirty feet bearing royal gifts heighten the effective impact of the Holy Birth by antithesis, even as they provide a pictorial scaffolding on which the weighty composition rests. Rubens likely understood these figures as a particular type associated with the act of laboring. One of the Italian theorists who most inspired the early Rubens in Rome, Gianpaolo Lamazzo, described a type of so-called martial figure in ways that might have contributed to the roughest of Rubens's working males, such as those seen here. According to the 1598 English translation of Lamazzo's treatise on painting, such figures should, quote, exhibit great raised and hard limbs, strong joints, mighty bones, a swart complexion mixed with adult red, low forehead, great eyes, open nostrils, darkish hair, and stiff curled locks, delighting altogether in what Lamazzo called, quote, laborious matters, as to bear arms, exercise his body in wrestling, and other such like activities. Lamazzo characterized those actions of this type as, quote, rough, hard, and cruel, end quote. Early modern commentators noted similar features of Rubens's working figures too. Indeed, they were often critiqued close to their day as too hard, too heavy, too ruddy, and even incorrect in their design. In the 18th century, Weiermann singled out the bald executioner of the Raising as an example of exceptional force, given the, quote, violent effort, end quote, of his actions and the unusually intimidating breadth of his shoulders. In a similar vein, de Camp in 1769 noted the exaggerated heaviness in Rubens's treatment of the executioners, and described the Herculean St. Christopher as, quote, exaggerated and mannered, as if striking to create a great character, end quote. Later in the century, Reynolds in 1781 asserted St. Christopher's color was too red and too bricky, and the outline not flowing. He also remarked that the active bustle of the executioners in the Raising offered a fine contrast to Jesus' resignation, and further critiqued the bald executioner for having a shoulder that appeared, quote, somewhat defective and too round. Despite widespread critiques of Rubens's designs, even in his own day, it is almost certain that he intended these rough features as particularly apt for laboring subjects. This point is highlighted by two related drawings dated circa 1609. At left, the Boijmans drawing of a robust kneeling man appears to rise as if lifting something heavy. It exhibits an unusually forceful style, even by Rubens's already muscular standards. Marked by quick sprezzatura drawing and openly visible penimenti, the sheet style is almost certainly meant to match the figure's forceful act. In the loose sheet at right, the roughness of the working figure, exemplified in the face and torso, appears matched by an exaggerated roughness and strength in the use of black chalk. Rubens first investigated the underlying idea for these laboring figures in theoretical notes and drawings while in Italy. Many of these are found in Jambert's 1773 translation of Rubens's early Latin treatise on the human figure, De Figuras Humanis, and I should say that Teresa Esposito introduced this volume quite well, so I won't do a lot of that. But to say that it also included illustrations engraved by Piero Avellin after Rubens's original design. This treatise is particularly interesting for our purposes, given that Rubens placed unusual emphasis in the treatise in both word and image on the laboring actions of his classically inspired robust figures, especially those carrying, portant, heavy objects. For example, the design at left focuses on the unusual virile labors of some of his most important sculptural models in Rome, drawn in the act of their characteristic labor. Here, the Trojan priest Laocoon struggles to free himself from the bind of serpents. Hercules lifts the Erythmanian boar, and Atlas carries the weight of the heavens. Similarly, Rubens's Leonardo-inspired design at right emphasizes not only the strong acts of strong men pushing and pulling, but also the arm muscles involved in them. In his corresponding text, Rubens again focused on the figure's acts and the types of physical laborers that are best represented in them. Here, he named the acts of carrying, pulling, and lifting heavy objects, of porters or athletes as requiring the most strength seen in the upper body and thighs. And in his Virgil-inspired chapter entitled On Athletes, Rubens described the two combating figures of Darius and Entellus in terms strikingly similar to Lamazzo's own, noting their vigorous actions were particularly manifested in, quote, agitated, vigorous arms, large shoulders, big bones, and strong joints, end quote, and their proud, audacious characters. Rubens expressed similar concerns in his early Latin treatise on the imitation of antique statuary, also penned in Rome. In this laconic tract, he praised the retracted stomach, agitated muscular arms, legs, and shoulders, and what he called any other part, as expressing the relative chaleur or heat of the robust male nude. He named the strong backs of porters and other laborers, the legs of dancers, and almost the whole body of rammers and wrestlers as important models. Rubens both valued the act of robust laboring early on in his Roman period and seems to have worked hard to find a way to embody it. As Rubens also clarified in his Imitation treatise, the sculptural intelligence of classical sculpture, especially Hellenistic models, provided his classical underpinnings. Willem Panneel's red chalk drawing, after Rubens's original design at left, highlights bodily form as a function of the active strain of a wrestler caught in mid-action, a lesson Rubens adapted from the 3rd century Roman wrestlers he studied in Italy at Rite. Most of these models had physical struggle, work, or extreme physical force or athleticism at their conceptual cores. Some of his favored models included the Farnese Hercules, the Vatican Laocoon, and the Belvedere Torso, all of which he studied in person in drawings or theoretical sheets. He also looked to other, sometimes lesser-known classical models and Renaissance paintings he knew around Rome. For example, he likely borrowed the position and action of his kneeling porters from this Roman marble garden relief depicting the sacrifice of the ox in the Villa Medici. Federico Barocci's paintings may have also informed his working figures. Barocci's presentation of the Virgin in the temple includes a working male with a somewhat slighter, though still muscular, bare shoulder, leading a sacrificial lamb. This painting, in part, might have inspired Rubens's own laboring porters. He would have known the painting well, given it already hung in the Chiesa Nuova while he worked on his most significant early commission for the high altar around 1606. Rubens's choice of such esteemed models highlights the virtuous underpinnings he accorded his laboring figures and suggests by extension that there could be greater virtue in laboring too. For Rubens, who had embraced Lipsy and Stoicism in life as in many paintings of his Italian period, this arguably had everything to do with positive ideas of sustained individual exertion as a potentially ameliorative force that Lipsius and others in his circle ascribed to the concept of labore. While manual laborers were indeed widely denigrated in early modern Europe, the act of laboring that produced something of value across strict social hierarchies was seen as an altogether different matter in the right hands. Recent scholarship has emphasized the importance of laboring across all social strata in early modern Europe, with the exception of the aristocracy, whose status, given their divinely ordained wealth and superior status at birth, was contingent on not laboring at all. In this framework, the idea of laboring might be understood not solely as the physical labor of the lowest societal rungs, but rather, in historian James Farr's words, as any activity performed in the sphere of perceived social or cultural necessity. Depending on social status, these activities could be material, immaterial, or both. According to Farr, all early modern social orders except the aristocracy engaged in and valued some type of labor, albeit of vastly different types and qualities. At the bottom of the social scale were the poor, unskilled peasants who engaged in the most physical and dirty sorts of toil, such as tilling the fields and shoveling manure, activities associated with bodily fatigue, degradation, and lack of rules. Moving up the scale were trained artisans manually skilled in the so-called mechanical arts, followed by financiers, lawyers, and merchants, whose more highly ranked work required skill, significant schooling, and intelligence. Those who engaged in no manual labor at all included scholars and so-called nobles of the robe, or the man of letters, that is, studied elites like Lipsius and his disciples who worked with intellect and distinction in noble surroundings. Such strict hierarchies and the inevitable tensions between them bear relevance for early modern artistic practice and self-representation too. In part, they help drive a desire by early modern humanists from Cennini to Leonardo to raise the social and material rank of the master artist from trained skilled worker to an intellectual and divinely inspired gentleman painter of letters. In these 16th century Stradanus prints comparing art to alchemy in the Nova Reperta, It has been observed that the dirty physical work of apprentices, such as grinding pigments and preparing canvases, is shown separate from the master's domain. Shown at left as a scholar in fine clothes directing his pupils from the seat of honor, the erudite humanist artist, here thought to represent Jan van Eyck, was seen to rely on a loftier type of labor, grounded in the intellect, study, and imagination. Valuing mental invention over manual execution, Rubens would almost have certainly placed himself in this category, as did Lipsius's friend, the pictor doctus, and Rubens's own teacher, Otto von Veen. Unlike his younger contemporary Rembrandt, who often represented himself plying the tools of his trade as a painter in his self-portraits, Rubens's primary work appears to have been intellectual and based in classical study. In the Four Philosophers group portrait, he pictures himself with his brother Philip, his friend Favarius, and a posthumous yet still teaching Lipsius, who gestures to his rather recently published books of classical learning. While Rubens painted the erudite Lipsius's speaking hand as well lit and active, he notably painted his own right painting hand as dark and visibly muted, that is, not working at all. And I would encourage you all to look again at this portrait, because I think I looked at this group portrait, because I think I've looked at it a lot, and I never noticed that his painting hand is actually in that picture very darkly up against his robe. Two first-hand accounts of Rubens' painting in the studio in the 1620s reinforce the point. According to Otto Sperling in 1621, Rubens, quote, while still painting, was having Tacitus read aloud to him and was dictating a letter. When we kept silence so as not to disturb him with our talk, he began to talk to us, while still continuing to work, to listen to the reading, and to dictate his letter, answering our questions, and thus displaying his astonishing powers, end quote. In 1629, Englishman Sanderson described Rubens's physical work of art emerging effortlessly forth from the working intellect to a following hand. In his words, quote, Rubens with his arms across, sit musing upon his work for some time, and in an instant, with a nimble hand, would force out his overcharged brain into description, end quote. Rubens seems to have also appreciated that such intellectual exertion could also have a valuable component of manual laboring following it. Moreover, Rubens was apparently well versed in the related neo-Stoic virtues of Labora as well. Indeed, it was one of the key principles promoted in Lipsian and indeed Rubens's own circles by the Antwerp Planten Press. This Holtzius print shows founder Christopher Planten with his press's well-known device, a turning compass inscribed with the motto, Labora et Constantia. This device appeared widely in sculptural reliefs, drawings, and prints, and is said to have stood for both the intellectual and manual aspects of Planten and his printing enterprise, which were undergirded by the values of sustained energy and exertion, guided by reason and unimpassioned steadfastness. Rubens knew the model well. He even executed the design for the gilded relief that still hovers over the central doorway of the Planten Moretus Museum, then the Planten Moretus Press. The connections between Lipsius, Planten, and Rubens were all very close, suggesting Rubens likely took the Lipsian idea of labore to heart as well. Planten published many of Lipsius's most important neo-Stoic tracts, including De Constantia et De Politica, and even kept a room in the workshop for Lipsius to correct his own proofs. In Rubens's day, the Planten and the then Planten Moretus Press also published many new editions and reprintings of Lipsius's texts, including his revised edition of Seneca the Younger's Opera Omnia, first published in 1605 and reprinted multiple times, notably all with the title page designed by Rubens. This title page from the 1637 edition shows a portrait of Lipsius crowned by the light of knowledge, undergirded by his neo-Stoic guides, Seneca and Tacitus. This 17th century emblem, first published by Gabriel Rollenhagen in a Latin edition of 1611, helps clarify how the terms labore et constantia might have been understood together in this context. The English distich translates the phrase as, quote, good hopes, we may best accomplish by laboring in a constant way, end quote. In Rubens's day, laboris likely implied some type of toil or exertion, while constantia, as expressed in Lipsius's tract, suggested unimpassioned steadiness and reasoned constancy. Together in a Lipsian context, they implied the necessity for sustained action and exertion grounded in an even-handed right reason, ratio. With the added commentary, it is difficult, the emblematist emphasizes that good hopes, like good works, demanded difficult physical and intellectual action too. Rubens's design for the plant in relief highlights another important point, that he also aptly embraced the virtuous laboring Hercules as his primary personification for Labora in painting. To the left of the Plantin device stands strong Hercules as the personification of Labora, and at right, the female personification of steady constancy. In Erasmus Quillenius's 1640 Rubens-inspired composition seen here, the laboring Hercules even takes Plantin's place and robustly turns the compass himself, seemingly without end, while steady constancy easily holds it for him at the circle's perfect center. For Rubens, Hercules seems to have represented laboring of a morally sound sort, physical athleticism, wisdom, and even civic virtue. This 1605 title page design for the first edition of Lipsius's opera Omnia, designed by Rubens, shows Hercules, along with Ulysses and Pallas Athena, as paragons of classical wisdom and virtue. In this late oil sketch dated to the 1630s, he made the connection explicit between virtuous laboring and the intellect by showing a running Hercules as Prometheus carrying the Promethean torch of knowledge. At other times, he associated Hercules with moral strength. This 1632 allegorical sketch of Hercules as heroic virtue stamping down social discord for the Whitehall banqueting ceiling illustrates the neo-Stoic civic bent of Rubens's hopes for peace through laboring with physical, intellectual, and moral strength. For Rubens and Plantin, I would argue, for Lipsius and Plantin, and I would argue Rubens too, sustained laborers and unimpassioned reason and intellect went hand in hand, especially when they were seen to serve a virtuous higher cause. The similarly social and moral stakes involved in Rubens's embrace of Hercules, or indeed his own non-mythological laboring figures, are further clarified when we look at examples of works showing their opposites. That is, the truly ignoble and morally bereft figures that are flabby, impotent, unexercised, or not doing anything at all. For example, Rubens's early Samson and Delilah in London features a muscular yet defeated Samson bearing Michelangelo's lifeless hanging arm. Wholly under the power of the wily seductions of Delilah, Samson represents a clear bodily assertion of the ultimate moral or physical weakness of one lacking constant control of his faculties. Other examples of physical and moral unfitness include Rubens's flabby, drunken Silenus and the physically weak and twisting figure of Icarus, who sailed too close to the sun out of hubris. In the Antwerp miracles of St. Ignatius, the man on his back who is being exorcised of demons uncontrollably seizes, registering a moral weakness and neo-Stoic inconstancy that strikingly contrasts with the upright man who pulls to lift him. Rubens himself addressed the artistic and social implications of these impotent figures in his brief but philosophically weighty invocation of physical and intellectual flabbiness in his early Lipsian-inspired treatise on imitation. Set in the context of concerns over contemporary lack of exercise, he castigated what he called effeminate males who did not engage in continual exercise as being prone to laziness, eating too much, and weakness. He particularly claimed that men of his time were fat, especially in the stomach, and devoid of muscles in the arms and legs. By contrast, he explicitly praised the well-exercised, muscular, robust man, inspired by the most esteemed classical models, as a metaphor for the value of intellectually grounded exercise and renewed artistic vigor. In this vein, he also notably mentioned it mentioned the well-exercised muscular athlete of the classical Greek gymnasium, praised in Mercurialis's 1573 treatise on exercise as exemplary of the strength and virtue of such physical and social bodies in antiquity, honed through constant exercise. Rubens most certainly knew Mercurialis's text firsthand. After all, the author was both a friend of Lipsius and the physician to Cardinal Farnese. Through his invocation of Mercurialis in this context, Rubens ultimately expressed his own beliefs in the importance of artistic well-being grounded in continually exercising one's mind through a deep athletic study of the sculptural intelligence of the ancients and a close Aristotelian attention to separating underlying form or idea from base stone or matter. With its emphasis on exercise and physical and artistic well-being, the Imitation treatise again bears the Lipsian philosophical mark. In a period of severe social disruption, Lipsy and Stoicism responded to potent fears about social sickness and the decline of the social body. As historian Andrea McCrae noted, these fears manifested themselves in recurring metaphors of physical and intellectual laziness and bodily sickness in Neo-Stoic circles, relating to fears about social decline associated with the devastation of war in the run-up to the 30 Years' War of 1618 to 48. Philosopher John Sellers has also highlighted the related importance of continual exercise to Stoic philosophy and to early modern physical metaphors in Neo-Stoic circles for achieving health in the larger body politic. By contrast, Lipsius offered social prescriptions grounded in a pragmatic, civically minded, Tacitean approach to retaining good hopes in the civic sphere. He further highlighted how the working process of the upright mind of a good man, the so-called vir bonus, might be reflected in energetic and virtuous physical and intellectual actions in the civic sphere. According to Gerhard Ostrich, what distinguished Netherlandish Neo-Stoicism from its classical models was its emphasis on struggle as perseverance, along with energetic forward thinking and the use of reason to temper the passions towards constancy. Even Rubens's travel to Italy to inform his new mature style with the lessons of the ancients might have been seen in terms of a Lipsian approach to intellectual and physical laboring. Linguistically related to work or travail, travel itself was viewed as nothing short of physical labor itself. Given the exhausting physical difficulties of voyaging for long periods on foot, boat, or wagon, often over difficult terrain in poor conditions, travel was first explicitly associated in early modern Europe with what one contemporary emblematist called, quote, toil and labor void of rest, end quote. This idea is illustrated in the first 1586 Plantin edition of Geoffrey Whitney's Emblems, seen here. Lipsius notably extended this idea to the intellectual realm as well, in his desire to, quote, really travel, vere peregrinare, a primarily intellectual pilgrimage he explicitly associated with sustained mental laboring and the capacity of an elite few for unusually recondite learning. To, quote, really travel, in Lipsius's view, was thus arguably a difficult and sustained, yet rewarding intellectual journey, and ideally a physical one too, to what he called the, quote, compendium of the world, unquote, Rome. Rubens's physical and intellectual travel to Rome places him again squarely in Lipsius's lineage. According to Samuel van Hoogstraten, Rubens was criticized there for copying, quote, after so few Italian paintings and only spending his precious time wandering, looking, and sitting quietly, end quote. Using a language of intellectual labor, Rubens retorted, quote, I am most busy when you see me idle, end quote. As Rubens's contemporary, the so-called poet of labor, Ben Jonson, wrote, arts that respect the mind were ever reputed nobler than those that serve the body. Though we less can be without them, the mind of man is still fed with labor, end quote. Rubens's early theoretical studies in Rome suggest that he too ultimately associated his own working bodies with artistic virtue of a poetic kind. In his treatise on the human figure, transcribed by Jean Bert, he praised male energy, robustum, and hot-blooded ruddiness, rubor, as markers of strong activity and, by extension, physical and moral health, much as Lipsius did, or Quintilian in antiquity. Similarly, Rubens's contemporary Franciscus Junius emphasized the importance of sustained activity and energy in his painting of the ancients of 1647-48. According to Junius, quote, healthful male bodies, and such bodies as by a continual exertation are filled with good and pure blood, receive their favor out of the same things out of which they receive their strength, end quote. In this context, one 19th century writer, Silvestre, aptly described the Rubens of the Elevation and Descent, quote, as the poet of robust health who has never been sicklied over with the pale cast of thought. This laboring, healthy poetic style also finally plays out in Rubens's labored, incorrect style of drawing his newly valorized figures, including in the Bohemond drawing. Reflecting a muscular style of drawing, the sheet's open flexed contours and graphic pentimenti highlight Rubens's openness to freely altering his forms while in the process of drawing. Much like Lipsius's sprezzatura style of writing that is said to have revealed his open delight in the active process of thinking, Rubens's visible revisions show the drawing as a healthy work in progress, subject to further intellectual and physical interventions, and Rubens's own sustained exercise of thinking and drawing. In both form and style, his robustly executed figures, such as the vigorous and later Hercules carrying the torch of knowledge, or indeed Rubens's signature laborers, they reflect his own expressive labors, drawing and painted with a heated mind and a vigorous hand, all tempered by constant reason to match the laboring and constancy of his own mind. In the end, Rubens returned to the laboring theme in the 1630s with a number of works, including the Bohemond's oil sketch of Thetis receiving Achilles' armor from Vulcan at left, and the martyrdom of St. Lavinius at right. They also appear in compositions, most notably this painting of Vulcan, most notably this painting of Vulcan forging a thunderbolt for Jupiter in Madrid, dated around 1638. Named the patron deity of alchemy by the Renaissance physician Paracelsus, and associated like Prometheus with fire and divine creativity, Vulcan, like the erudite artist with whom he was often compared in the day, held the power to shape knowledge and art through the toiling hammer of his blows. This meant constantly working to forge something useful and virtuous out of the heat and toil of his working hand and anvil, and the basest of materials. Painted just years before he died, Vulcan forging was likely a self-portrait of sorts, painted to stand for the laboring artist himself. Ultimately, Rubens's highly metaphorical laboring figures stand, I conclude, as final valorizations of the persistence of intellectual labor and heat, and the capacity of his working figures and the working of his own signature painting hand to stand for both. Paradoxically reflecting the artist's early intellectual athleticism, social refinement, and his ambitions for art to be both self-referential and socially ameliorative, Rubens, at least for a time, transformed reimagined immaterial laboring bodies into painted ones. Evidently, for Rubens like Vulcan, otherwise base physical labor and earthly materials went perfectly hand in hand with artistic perfection of both immaterial and material types. Thank you.